Welcome to TV on TV. I'm State Representative Tommy Vitolo. You're watching Brookline Interactive Group. Today is Thursday, April 6th, and we have a great show for you today. Today, our guest is Select Board member and Select Board candidate, John VanScoyoc. We've got a 25-minute interview with him, recorded just a few days ago. But first, as always, the news. Former President Donald Trump was arraigned Tuesday on 34 felony charges related to falsifying business records. Judge Janet Protasewicz won a Wisconsin State Supreme Court seat, returning court control to liberals for the first time in 15 years. This comes as the state court is expected to hear cases related to abortion rights and redistricting. Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey has appointed Robbie Goldstein, a CDC policy advisor, MGH infectious disease doctor, and progressive Democrat, to serve as the Department of Health commissioner. Attorney General Andrea Campbell is seeking to take on white supremacist groups after a civil rights suit was filed by the New Hampshire Attorney General against a neo-Nazi group. The city of Boston voted 8-4 yesterday to adopt the specialized stretch energy code, which requires new construction to be wired for all electric. The Brookline Neighborhood Alliance held a select board candidate forum for the May 2nd townwide election this past Monday. A recording can be viewed on Brookline Interactive Group. Allendale farm workers have launched their first contract campaign, calling for better wages, benefits, work conditions, and job security for seasonal workers. That's the news for the week. And as I said, we're going to flip over to a pre-recorded interview with Select Board member and Select Board candidate, John VanScoyoc. We'll see you on the flip. And we're back here on TV on TV. You're watching Brookline Interactive Group. And as promised, today I have Select Board member and Select Board candidate, John VanScoyoc. John, welcome to the show.
Tommy, thank you very much for having me on the show. And I am wearing my button, which hardly shows on the screen, but I'm sure you give me permission to wear my button.
You bet. It's your, listen, it's your world. We're just living in it. You're the candidate. And we want to give you the opportunity. We want to give you the opportunity.
It's my world.
We want to give you the opportunity to tell us about yourself. So listen, I'm going to ask you the same question I ask everybody else. What have you been doing your whole life? Tell us about yourself.
My whole life. Let me just say that I'm having a good week, if you don't mind my saying so. And I'll tell you the reasons why. I got endorsed by Brookline PACs, which is wonderful. And it's an organization that's been around a while, and I really deeply respect it. So to get their endorsement meant a lot to me. And on top of that, I got the endorsement of a group called Brookline by Design. And that's also an organization much newer than PACs. Very focused on planning and the importance of planning in sort of steering us towards the future we want for Brookline. And to have their endorsement meant a lot to me. To have both endorsements means, almost more than twice as much. And in addition to that, I just had what I called a Grow the Vote kickoff yesterday at the Washington Square Tavern in Brookline. And I was it was so good to be able to fill that treasured space. I mean, in Washington Square Tavern is kind of like one of those places in Washington Square that you sort of feel like it's part of what makes Washington Square. And to fill that space, to have people telling me afterwards that they were so happy just to be able to get reacquainted with a lot of folks sort of post-COVID, to be in the room, to sort of be feeling good, to hear from me, and to be excited about this election that's coming up. Anyway, it's been a good week. As to my life in very short summation, I kind of summed it up yesterday for the folks at the event that first of all, I called myself your living proof that Brookline's government by your next door neighbor is still alive and well. So in many senses, I am just like everybody who is watching this tonight or today, who's been living in Brookline for quite a number of years. In my case, feels like they like the town, they like their neighborhood, they like the street they live on. And yet the difference where I'm concerned is that I got this crazy idea a few years back that maybe I could serve the town by being at town meeting And then that led to me being on the advisory committee. And then that led to me being the advisory committee chair for a while. And then I had sort of an interruption to all of that furious activity aimed at becoming more civically involved in Brookline when I went into television from a career in print journalism, or an early career in print journalism, and my later career was in television journalism. And I had to kind of rein in my political impulses and not sort of get into the give and take of politics locally quite as much as I had. But then I retired. And so when I retired, just a few years back, it kind of gave a rebirth in me of that urge to get out there, get in the arena, serve the town, and try again. I had tried once before to be elected to the select board, and I learned a lesson from it, but I didn't get elected. So I tried again in 2020. Boy, did that turn out to be an interesting experience, because I couldn't have known it when I announced that I was going to run for the select board, but it turned out to be the year that COVID hit us full force. And I had to adjust the campaign. I had to adjust my expectations of starting my service on the select board in May, the way anybody would in any other year. We had to postpone the election until June. And then I had to spend the better part of my term, my 3-year term, and this is my first 3-year term. I hope it's not my last. I had to spend the better part governing as one of 5 members of the select board without ever sitting down face to face with my fellow select board members. So it's been a wild ride.
Now, viewers may not remember as clearly as you and I do. So you announced you were going to run for select board. Nobody had really heard of COVID, or maybe it was,
Right.
a few cases somewhere halfway across the world.
Right.
And I remember these questions like, hey, do I do an in-person kickoff party or not? Because it was like right around the time when cases started shooting up. And by the time the election came along, it came along a month later than expected. And people were allowed to vote by mail.
Yep.
And it was a very different feel, very difficult to campaign. But you were successful, and you got sworn in a month late. So, you're amongst the select board members who have served the least amount of time for a full term. And how did that first term go? Right. You said there wasn't enough face-to-face time, and that made some challenges, but walk us through.
Or just the beginning.
Yeah, walk us through some of your successes and some of the things that got accomplished over the last 3 years.
I'm happy to. And yeah, that was just the beginning of the challenges. So again, just mentioning this kickoff that we had yesterday so successfully, I cited 3 what I called crises that we as a select board had to tackle in that first term. And of course, COVID was the number one at the time. And what I'll say about the select board and its role in the COVID crisis was that, first of all, we made sure that our public health officials, as I knew they would, were issuing the best of advice to people based on fact, based on the authoritative advice from the federal level, the state level, and from their own knowledge of public health. And we supported them every step of the way in that. But we also supported them and the frontline responders with resources. And that commitment never wavered. So that was COVID, crisis number 1. And I have to be very careful how I say this, because I never like to take credit for things that we can't sort of clearly identify as being the credit is deserved. But Brookline did okay with COVID. Brookline's rates of COVID were quite good compared. I mean, there was nothing good about COVID, but compared to other communities, we kept it under control in good ways, and with very good results for those who managed to survive and come out the other side of COVID, and to this day I think are very grateful for the kind of response that Brookline had. So I'm glad that happened. I'm not going to say that because the select board supported the public health officials, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but I know we did the right things. And so that was COVID. Um, and then the next crisis, which was simultaneous with COVID, people got to remember this. Not only had COVID set in by the time I finally got to be sworn in as on the select board, but also what had set in was the tragedy of George Floyd and this national crisis over policing practices in many places in this country that had been utterly unjust, tragically unjust, vis-a-vis Black and brown communities, and the way that the police treated Black and brown communities and the way that they treated the rest of the society. And Brookline got swept up in that. You know, we can argue, I suppose, endlessly, but I hope we've sort of settled the argument as to, you know, whether maybe the record in Brookline was much better than a lot of the communities where, in fact, there needed to be a very profound change in practices. But the record in Brookline wasn't perfect, and we needed to take an honest look in Brookline at the policing records in terms of the stops that are made, the arrests that are made, the field interrogations that are done, and also in terms of the feeling in the community, the feeling among in the Black and brown community, the feeling in other communities that are non-white, as to whether they trusted the police. And it almost, in a sense, it didn't matter if the data showed that for the most part, Brookline's police have been transparent and have been trustworthy. If that feeling wasn't coming across in those communities, we needed to face it. And so we had a really, really difficult conversation about policing, but we came out the other side of it with improved practices. And that's number two that I'll cite for the select board in that period of time. We now have a police commissioners advisory committee. They had a meeting just a week ago. I would advise anybody to look at the tape of that meeting and see for themselves the kind of difficult but very respectful conversations that are now happening on a regular basis, thanks to the PCAC, between officials of the police and members of the public. So that's number two. And then the number three was, lucky us, lucky me in my first term on the select board. All of a sudden, we've got a town administrator who's retiring, and all of a sudden, we've got turnover in all of these key departments at town hall. And all of a sudden, we have this thing called COVID that has caused people to completely rethink their expectations of their working lives, and caused a lot of them to kind of retreat from employment or retreat from their daily working routines. And so we had to adjust to all of those things. We ended up doing a search, got, I think, a very, very capable successor to Mel Kleckner. Before I just wrap up these three crises that I identify with my first term, I also want to mention two things. In the policing category, part of what changed was that we came to agreement. It wasn't easy, but we finally came to agreement on Jen Pastor as our chief of police. She's fantastic. And the other thing that sort of hung over us this entire time was the reality of having to face the climate change crisis that was global. And so we made a lot of forward progress on that too, which I think we can talk about later in this interview.
So you did 3 years. You helped to guide the community through a series of crises and challenges, one international, one national, and one local. And you want another bite of the apple. You want another 3 years. That must mean you've got some ideas for things on the horizon. You've got some ideas for what you want to accomplish in the next 3 years. Tell us about what you've got up your sleeve for 2023 through 2026.
Sure. And I'm going to pick up where I left off with climate change. I went through my own, I'll just call it a evolution in my thinking about climate change. And it happened very fast. It happened the first time that I was challenged by someone who said, you're not taking this crisis seriously enough. And I began to think about it a little bit more deeply. And before you know it, I was coming to the conclusion that I don't mean to over dramatize this, but in the remaining years of my life, I want to do everything I can to move myself personally forward, but also move my town forward, maybe move others forward towards actually making progress towards these goals that we have set, these very ambitious goals that we have set, because they are super ambitious. You know, international organizations keep reminding us we're not getting there. We've set these goals not just as a town and a state and a nation, but as a planet, and we're not getting there. But we have to keep working at it. We have to keep working at it because latest report that came out that said, we are rushing towards the that critical point where temperatures have risen. I think it's 1.5 degrees, and there is a point of no return at some, eventually in this heating of the planet, and we can't let ourselves, we can't give ourselves a pass if we're not meeting our goals. So I want to be part of that in Brookline. I want to see things happen like this. I want to see us say, okay, eventually the entire vehicle fleet, with a couple of exceptions for heavy duty equipment, is going to have to be electric. How many electric vehicle purchases did we make this year? I want to see us sort of define the progress towards converting the fleet to electric in numbers. And then I want to see us track those numbers, and I want to see us be accountable for those numbers. Same thing with heating systems in our municipal buildings. Every now and then we need to replace a heating system in a municipal building. Are we replacing it with fossil fuel-free heating systems? We need to do that. How many times do we replace heating systems over, a year, 2 years, 5 years? How many of them did we stop and say, we're not going to do this unless we can convert the building to electric heat? So we need to make it real specific and work really hard at achieving those goals. That's just climate change. You want me to give you a couple others?
Yeah, don't take as long for all of them. We've only got another 9 minutes, but give us a few other items that are on your mind. Yeah,
thank you. I do think that something that was brought up by our chair, who in a way that was difficult for her personally, decided that the job of chair of the select board eventually in her second term was just demanding too much. And there's a lot of people who feel that way now in Brookline, that there's a misalignment between our Brookline town government and the level of time it requires from people as volunteers and the needs of the town as a whole for governance these days. And they want to have a conversation about whether we need to transition away from a town, from a government. So I do want to see that progress. And then another thing I want to see progress in specific terms is, how are we going to increase the number of affordable housing units in Brookline? Because I think that what some people call the trickle-down approach, there's many different varieties of the trickle-down approach, but they basically try to leverage subsidized housing units out of development that includes many, many not subsidized units. I think that approach doesn't get us there fast enough. I think we're missing an obvious approach, which is illustrated by what we did with the well tower development that yielded millions of dollars, that produced dozens of new housing units for the Brookline Housing Authority's Colonel Floyd project on Marion Street. And we need to partner with the BHA to see if we can do more of those. BHA has got thoughts on doing similar rebuilds of some of their projects. And when they rebuild those projects, if we can leverage more units, every single one of which would be a subsidized housing unit, we ought to do it. And the last thing we ought to do on the housing front is echo the call of groups like Greater Boston Interfaith Organizations, who are calling on Governor Healy right now to double the amount of state appropriations for housing authorities. And double the amount of money going into the maintenance of those housing authorities, because that's a crying need that has been neglected for too long.
Neglected for too long, but I will straighten my tie and point out that the Brookline delegation has actually gotten additional money for Brookline to begin to address those needs.
And that's great.
More recently.
Yeah.
whether or not you're Ronald Reagan's great communicator or not, you clearly are a communicator. You have this tremendous experience with TV and print, but you also have a newsletter read by many. Tell us about your newsletter and how that ties in with your ability to accomplish things as a select board member.
Thank you. I get more positive feedback on that newsletter than just about anything that I can cite. And I think it speaks to there being a hunger in Brookline for two things. We lost the newspaper we had, the local newspaper coverage that we had, both the tab and the patch have sort of withered. And so people want news, and they literally have no sources on a regular basis of news. So I try to give them news, and I try to keep them up to date on things that are happening within the town government that I think they need to know about. But the other thing that I think they're hungry for is to have a focus in that news on what do we mean by good government, and can we get away from the kind of left-right polarized discussions of housing issues or racial justice issues, you name it. Can we get past the approach that basically says, I've got my narrative and you've got your narrative, and now let's talk past each other with our conflicting narratives. There needs to be a narrative of the middle, and that's what I mean by this thing I call good government for Brookline. But it's also what I try to convey to people through the weekly newsletter, the All Politics newsletter, that at some point in the middle of things, we can look at sort of the facts, we can look at the numbers, we can look at what we say we're going to do about the climate versus what we are actually doing. We can look at what we say we need to do in housing versus what it will take to get there. And, we can just have these much more informative discussions that don't rely on basically one side has to win and the other side has to lose. And that's what I'm trying to promote.
There are 3 ballot questions coming up. Question 1 is a roughly $172 million debt exclusion to rebuild Pierce. Question 2 is an operating override that will fund a long list of priorities each and every year that we just don't have enough money to cover now. And question 3 would cap the number of cannabis retailers to 4, which is the number that we have now. Do you have positions on any of these 3 questions, or is there anything you want to talk about with respect to questions 1, 2, or 3?
Yes. And I'm going to have to, obviously, I'm using up all my time, but I'll try to keep these answers a little bit shorter. First of all, question 1, Pierce, and that's the one that I think is perhaps the most on everyone's mind. Let's acknowledge that I'm a person who in 2019 led a campaign which everybody thought was destined to fail, and that was a campaign to say no to what we called the Baldwin bundle. This 9th school combined with the Driscoll project that a lot of us said violated sort of a basic understanding in Brookline that when we build a new school, it should be near where the kids are. And even though people thought, no, Brookline never says no to projects, they did agree with us, and they said no to the Baldwin-Driscoll bundle. So I'm a person who knows that sometimes the best of efforts to come up with a plan for a replacement of a school or building of a new school get kind of off track. And I think in the case of the Pierce school, which I frankly, I love that community. And in a way, I love that school that a lot of people, I think, might say, how could you love that school? I keep hearing how terrible it is. But in fact, it's a very ambitious school that was built at a time when people had exciting and different ideas about education. And so it includes some open classroom spaces. People might think that it's all open classroom. It's not. It's got a number of closed classrooms, traditional classrooms, but it's also got a very exciting and open classroom space. And I hear from folks, former students, former teachers, current families, you wouldn't know it from the narrative, that around which the case for the school, the new school, the very expensive $212 million new school is being made. You wouldn't know that there are people who actually had good experiences at Pierce. And you also wouldn't know that when surveys are done, currently, I'm talking about in recent years, the Pierce community says to the level of 88% satisfaction with the with the school. And that's like number 1, 2, or 3 on question after question. Pierce comes out on top in terms of satisfaction by the parents and satisfaction by the staff. So again, I think we're in the world of narratives, and there needs to be a counter narrative to the yes case, the yes case that's being made by some very good people. We need to hear from the folks who have doubts about spending this much money, $212 million, an unprecedented amount of money, on a replacement school. And here's the key part, that isn't really going to get us any further along in terms of added spaces. It's the same number of spaces as the Driscoll School, and it's one whole section less than the school committee initially asked for, but was disapproved by the MSBA. And we lose the pedestrian bridge for the kids because that comes down. And we actually have to send the kids off in all different directions for the period of construction. So on balance, I think people need to hear the case made on both sides of the Pierce School question.
Well, John, I appreciate that. I know we're running out of time. I do want to make sure that the viewers know that the tax increase is not 212 million. It's about 174 million because the state is providing 38 million. And I raise that because there are a lot of signs next to your signs around town that say 212 million. I think that's incredibly misleading. It is true that the school costs 212, but the Brookline taxpayers are being asked to pay about 174. And I want to make sure the viewers understand that communication very clearly.
That's fine, Tommy.
Right?
But
so that's I think that's really important. But we're not here to debate that. I just want to when people,
no, we're not.
When something seems so awry, I do like to correct it regardless.
If we are going to debate it, give me 10 seconds for a response.
But I do want to give you.
It's all taxpayer dollars, Tommy. It's whether it's local or state.
Well, that's true.
School. That's
true.
School.
But Brookline pays into the state funds for taxpayer dollars every single year, whether or not we're getting them back for our community. This is our opportunity to get our fair share. Right? We paid into MSBA 2 years ago. We didn't get a school that year, or 3 years ago and didn't get a school that year, and so forth.
You and I should have a debate on this, because it also gets to questions about how the MSBA allocates funds. And I will just mention to people that when Brookline gets okayed for 38 million for a $212 million school, I know this for a fact, New Bedford gets turned down for a replacement or a project involving a much older school building, and they're getting turned down. So
that's right. And there must be a reason why.
And local
there must be a reason why. And I assure you, it's not that MSBA likes Brookline more than it likes New Bedford. It might be that they looked at the Brookline school and determined that while some had a good experience, it has substantial shortfalls that the New Bedford school doesn't have. But we got to wrap up this interview. John, I want to thank you for coming on the show. I want to thank you for your efforts for the past 3 years. Viewers may not know that you played an important role in making sure that this past January, Brookline Town Meeting took up the Specialized Stretch Energy Code, an important climate initiative. You played a significant behind the scenes role in making sure that that town meeting happened so quickly and so successfully.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I want to acknowledge that. You said climate change is important to you. You've actually, you've got some deliverables here, and I want to make sure our viewers know about that.
Yeah.
I also want to make sure they know that the election is less than a month away. It's on Tuesday, May 2nd. Polls are open 7 a.m. until 8 p.m. You can vote early in person and by mail. However you choose to vote, know that you've got a full complement of competitive townwide races. Almost certainly have competitive town meeting races. And of course, there are 3 ballot questions. Folks, thanks for watching TV on TV. John, again, thanks for coming on the show. And
thank you very much. It's been
great.
We'll
see you next week, everyone.
Take care.